They were right about one thing. I do talk to the dead. I have been talking to the dead since I was 5 years old, since the morning I woke up in my grandmother's cabin on the Turode plantation in Iberville Parish, Louisiana, and found her sitting at the foot of my sleeping mat, speaking quietly to someone I could not see. I asked her who she was talking to. She told me she was talking to her mother, who had died 14 years before I was born. I asked her if her mother talked back. She said yes, but not in words. In other things, in the way the candle flame moved when there was no wind, in the particular quality of silence that settled over a room when the dead were present, in the feeling that arrived sometimes in the chest, just below the sternum, like a hand pressing gently from the inside. I asked her to teach me. She said she already had. She said I had been born knowing. That the knowledge had come with me the way eye color comes, already decided, already present, requiring only time and attention to become fully itself. She was right about that too. My name is Delphine. I am 38 years old. I was branded a witch on a Thursday morning in April of 1859 by a man named Aldous Renard, who owned the sugarcane plantation in St. James Parish, where I had lived for 19 years, and who had decided, after 19 years of watching me do what I do, that naming what frightened him would give him power over it. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about most things. But he was spectacularly, catastrophically wrong about that particular thing, and the consequences of his wrongness were so complete and so precise and so perfectly matched to the nature of what he had done that I have spent the years since wondering whether it was my doing or the doing of the forces I had spent my life learning to work with. Whether the line between those two things is as clear as people who are afraid of those forces would like it to be. I have decided it is not, but I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, not my beginning, the beginning of the Renard family's end, which started long before they understood it had started, long before the branding, long before the moment when Aldous Renard made the mistake of giving a name to something he should have continued pretending not to see. Let me start with my grandmother. Her name was Marguerite. She had come from Saint-Domingue before the Revolution, brought to Louisiana on a ship that carried sugar and rum and human beings, with the same commercial indifference applied to all three categories of cargo. She had been a practitioner of the old religion in Saint-Domingue, trained by her own grandmother in the traditions that had come across the water from Dahomey and Yorubaland and the Congo Basin, and had survived the crossing and the plantation and the deliberate destruction of everything else, because they were carried inside people rather than in objects that could be confiscated or burned. She arrived in Louisiana with those traditions intact and with the particular adaptability of someone who understood that survival required translation. The Catholicism that covered Louisiana like a second sky was not a contradiction of what she carried. It was a new language for old knowledge. The saints had names for the forces she had always known. The rituals had forms that could contain what she had always practiced. The cross and the vive occupied the same spiritual territory, approached from different directions, and Marguerite was fluent in both. She settled eventually on the Turode plantation and lived there for 40 years, serving as the healer and spiritual advisor for the enslaved community with the quiet authority of someone whose gifts had been recognized and whose usefulness had been understood by successive generations of enslavers who found it more profitable to allow her practice than to suppress it. Enslaved people who were spiritually stable and communally cohesive were easier to manage than those who were not. This was the calculation that kept Marguerite's practice alive on the Turode plantation for 4 decades, and the calculation was not wrong. What was wrong was the assumption that the stability she created served the interests of the people who owned the community she was stabilizing. It served their interests in the way that all things built by enslaved people served their enslavers' interests. On the surface, in the visible layer, in the part that could be observed and measured and entered into a ledger. Beneath that surface, Marguerite was doing something else entirely. She was maintaining a community. She was preserving knowledge. She was keeping alive in the hearts and minds and bodies of the people she served the understanding that they were more than what slavery said they were, that they came from somewhere, that they were connected to forces larger than the plantation, that the dead were not gone but present, not silent but speaking, not powerless but possessed of a particular kind of power that the living could access if they knew how to listen. She taught me all of this. I was her granddaughter and her chosen student, and the person she had decided, before I was born, would carry what she carried after she was gone. She told me this directly when I was 7 years old, in the same matter-of-fact way she told me everything. You will do what I do after I am no longer here to do it. This is not a question. This is what you are. I did not argue. I did not have the personality for arguing with Marguerite. I had the personality for listening and learning and absorbing and eventually becoming, which was what she needed and what the knowledge required. By the time I was 12, I could identify every medicinal plant that grew within 3 miles of the Turo plantation and knew what each one did and how to prepare it. By 14, I had assisted at enough healing ceremonies to understand the relationship between the spiritual and the physical, the way that what happened in the body was connected to what happened in the spirit, and how treating one without the other produced incomplete results. By 16, I had begun working with the forces my grandmother called the Elway, the spirits that stood between the human world and the divine, the intermediaries who could be called upon and worked with by those who knew the protocols and were willing to accept the responsibilities that working with them entailed. The responsibilities were considerable. My grandmother was clear about this. The power she was teaching me was not a weapon to be picked up and put down casually. It was a relationship, a set of obligations that ran in both directions, between the practitioner and the forces she worked with, between the practitioner and the community she served, between the practitioner and the dead who had carried this knowledge forward through generations of suffering and expected it to be carried forward still. Using the power for personal convenience or personal revenge was not forbidden exactly, but it had costs that a serious practitioner understood and accepted before proceeding, and a serious practitioner proceeded with those costs fully in view rather than discovering them afterward. I was 20 years old when I was sold to the Renard plantation. Marguerite died 6 months before the sale. Not of illness. Of completion was the word she used in the last weeks of her life when she spoke about what was coming. She had done what she came to do. She was ready to go where the dead go, which in her understanding was not far and was not final. She would be available, she told me, in the way that the dead are available, not in words, in the other things, in the candle flame and the quality of silence and the feeling below the sternum. She has been available every day since. The Renard plantation sat on 600 acres of prime sugarcane land in St. James Parish, 20 miles upriver from New Orleans, on the west bank of the Mississippi. The main house was a grand structure of the kind that Louisiana planters built to announce their prosperity to the river traffic. 2 stories of white-painted wood with wide galleries on both floors and live oaks draped in Spanish moss along the approach road. From the river, it looked like a painting of something beautiful. From the inside, it was what it was. Aldous Renard was 51 years old when I arrived, a second-generation planter, his father having established the estate, and his own contribution being the expansion of it through purchase and marriage and the particular ruthlessness that the sugar economy rewarded. He was a man of medium height and extraordinary self-certainty, the kind of certainty that comes from decades of having every decision validated by the fact that the people around him were not in a position to tell him he was wrong. He had a wife, Marguerite, whose name I noted with the attention I gave to all coincidences, and 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters, ranging in age from 16 to 24. He also had 143 enslaved people, among whom I arrived as a replacement for a healer who had died the previous winter, and whose absence had created a gap in the plantation's health management that was costing him in ways he could calculate. He received me with the assessment of a man evaluating a purchase. He had heard, from the Turo family, that I had abilities. He used that word with the careful neutrality of a man who did not want to commit to a position on whether those abilities were real or useful or something he should officially acknowledge. Abilities. As if what I was had not yet been categorized and he was reserving judgment. "What do you do?" he asked me. His French was Creole, the Louisiana variety, close enough to my grandmother's language to be comfortable. "I heal," I said. I assist births. I manage the health of the people in my care. And the other things. His eyes were watchful. The things the Turodes mentioned. I listen, I said, to many things. He studied me for a long moment. Then he assigned me a cabin and told his overseer, a man named Broussard, to give me access to whatever I needed for my medical work. He said nothing about the other things. Neither did I. For the first 3 years, I focused entirely on the medical work. I established myself as the healer for the plantation's enslaved community, with the same thoroughness and care that my grandmother had taught me, treating illness and injury and the particular physical damage that the sugar harvest inflicted on bodies working in conditions designed for maximum output rather than human survival. The sugar harvest was the most brutal agricultural work in the American South. The cane cutting, the milling, the boiling of juice into sugar in open kettles at temperatures that scalded and maimed and killed, all of it conducted at a pace that the harvest season imposed and that the enslavers enforced because the cost of a failed harvest exceeded, in their calculation, the cost of the human damage the harvest produced. I treated burns and lacerations and the respiratory damage that came from breathing the smoke of the boiling kettles. I treated the exhaustion that went beyond tiredness into something that threatened the body's ability to continue. I treated the grief and despair that the plantation inflicted on the spirit as certainly as the harvest inflicted damage on the body, and I treated these with the understanding that the spirit and the body were not separate systems and that what wounded one wounded both. I also began, carefully and slowly, to do the other things. The community on the Renard plantation had been without a practitioner since the old healer died. The absence had created a spiritual vacuum that I could feel when I arrived, a kind of hollowness in the community's connective tissue, a loss of the sense of being held by something larger than the individual, of being part of a lineage that extended backward into the past and forward into the future and sideways into dimensions that the plantation could not contain or control. I began filling that vacuum in the 3rd month. Small things first. A ceremony for a child who had died in the harvest, conducted at night in the quarters with a small group of people who had known the child and needed somewhere to put their grief that was not just endurance. A blessing for a couple who had found each other in the impossible conditions of the plantation and wanted to mark what they had found with something that acknowledged its value. A consultation for an old man who was afraid of what was waiting for him on the other side of his declining health and who needed someone to tell him honestly, from experience with what was on that other side, that what was waiting was not what he feared. These things moved through the community the way all essential things move, quietly, through trust built slowly, through the particular networks that enslaved communities built inside the visible structures of plantation life, the networks that the enslavers could not see because they were not looking for them and because the people who maintained them had learned, over generations, how to make them invisible. By the end of the 1st year, I had established what my grandmother had maintained on the Turode plantation, a community held together by something the plantation could not provide and could not take away, a thread of connection to the ancestors and the forces they had carried forward, running beneath the surface of the daily brutality like water running beneath stone. Aldous Renard noticed something. He could not have said what exactly. He was not the kind of man who was sensitive to the subtle currents of spiritual life, but he was a man who paid close attention to productivity and morale and the general atmosphere of his operation, and something in that atmosphere had changed in ways he found difficult to account for. The enslaved people on his plantation were, in some quality he could not name, different than they had been before I arrived, more coherent, more present, more, and this was the word he used to his wife, which she repeated to me later in the casual way that people repeat things to someone they have categorized as furniture, more themselves. He did not like it. Men like Aldous Renard did not like the people they enslaved being themselves. Being themselves was a precondition of resistance. Being themselves meant knowing they were selves, which meant knowing they were not what slavery said they were, which was the most dangerous knowledge available to an enslaved person, and the knowledge that the entire architecture of slavery was designed to prevent. He watched me more carefully. I let him watch. What he saw was a healer doing her work. A woman who moved through the plantation's enslaved community with professional authority and genuine care. A woman who produced results, lower mortality, faster recovery from injury, better management of the chronic conditions that the harvest season produced, that benefited his operation in measurable ways. What he could not see was what was happening beneath the surface of all that, because what was happening beneath the surface was not visible to eyes that did not know how to look for it. He watched for 3 years before he decided that what he was seeing made him uncomfortable enough to act on. The action he chose was naming. He called me a witch for the first time in the autumn of 1858, in a conversation with his overseer Broussard that I was not supposed to hear and that I heard completely because I was on the other side of a wall that was thinner than either of them had considered. He said he thought the woman was practicing witchcraft among his slaves and that it was making them strange. Broussard asked what he meant by strange. Renard said he could not explain it exactly, but that they were different than they had been, and that the difference made him uneasy, and that he believed it was connected to whatever Delphine was doing in the quarters at night. He was not wrong. The naming moved through the plantation quickly. Witch. It was a word with specific weight in Louisiana in 1858, carrying the accumulated fear and fascination and hostility of a culture that had been in contact with African spiritual traditions for 150 years and had never resolved its ambivalence about them. On one side, the colonial Catholic Church, which had a clear position on witchcraft and a clear prescription for dealing with it. On the other side, the deep Louisiana reality that the traditions the Church condemned were everywhere, and that many of the people condemning them privately consulted practitioners when their own needs exceeded what the Church could provide. Aldous Renard had consulted a practitioner once, 7 years before I arrived, when his eldest son was sick with something the doctors in New Orleans could not diagnose. He had not told anyone. He had gone at night, alone, to a woman in the parish who was known for these things, and he had paid her, and his son had recovered. He had spent the following years constructing an interpretation of that event that did not require him to believe in what had happened, and the construction was fragile in the way that all dishonest structures are fragile, requiring constant maintenance and vulnerable to anything that challenged it too directly. I was challenging it too directly, simply by existing and doing what I did. He branded me in April of 1859. The branding was not a legal procedure, it was a personal one. He had the overseer Broussard hold me, and he applied a small iron to my left shoulder, a marking he said was to identify me as what I was, so that anyone who encountered me would know to be cautious. The iron was shaped like a simple cross, which I found in the cold clarity that pain produces when you refuse to give it your complete attention, deeply ironic. The cross, the symbol of the religion that condemned what I was, applied to the body of a woman whose grandmother had understood that the cross and the vive were different entrances to the same territory. I did not scream. I will not tell you it did not hurt. It hurt in ways that the body remembers long after the wound heals, in the scar tissue that forms and in the nerve endings that the scar contains, and in the particular quality of sensation that comes from a place on your body that has been marked against your will. But screaming was a gift I had decided not to give him, and so I did not give it. What I gave him instead was silence. And then, when Broussard released my arms and Renard stepped back with the iron and looked at me with the expression of a man who has just done something he has convinced himself was necessary, I gave him something else. I looked at him, directly. Without the lowered eyes that 14 years, 19 years of being enslaved, had trained me to perform. I looked at him with everything I was, everything my grandmother had made me, everything the dead had given me access to across 38 years of conversation with what was on the other side of the visible world. I looked at him with the full weight of what I knew about what the forces I worked with were capable of, when a serious practitioner decided that the costs of using them for something specific were costs she was willing to pay. He stepped back, not much, barely a foot, but he stepped back, and the expression on his face in the moment before he recovered himself and replaced it with the one that a man in his position was required to display was something I had never seen on his face before. Fear, real fear, not the social fear of reputation or the financial fear of loss. The older kind, the kind that lives in the body and responds to things the conscious mind is trying to explain away. The kind that knows, regardless of what the explanations say, that it is in the presence of something it cannot control. I held his gaze for 3 more seconds. Then I looked away, because I had given him exactly what I intended to give him and nothing more, and because the next part required patience and precision rather than confrontation. I went back to my cabin. The mark on my shoulder was already speaking to me, not in words, in the other things, in the particular quality of heat that came from it, in the message that the dead have ways of sending through the body when the body has been violated in a way they wish to respond to. I listened. The response came over the following weeks in the form of clarity, a complete and detailed understanding of what I was going to do and how I was going to do it and what it was going to cost. I sat with that understanding for a long time before I began, because my grandmother had taught me that the sitting was not delay, but preparation, that acting without fully accepting the costs was how practitioners made mistakes that could not be undone. I accepted the costs. Then I began. The Renard Plantation's sugar operation depended on 3 things: the cane itself, which grew in the fields and was vulnerable to disease and weather and the particular fungal infections that the Louisiana climate produced; the mill, which processed the cut cane into juice that could be boiled into sugar; and the boiling house, where the juice was cooked in open kettles over wood fires managed by enslaved workers, with extraordinary skill at a temperature and timing that the difference between quality sugar and ruined product depended entirely upon. I understood all 3 systems completely. I had been treating burns from the boiling house for 3 years. I knew the kettles and the fires and the men who managed them, and the precise conditions under which the process worked and the precise conditions under which it failed. I knew which of the boiling house workers were willing to introduce a small variation into their process at a critical moment, a variation so minor that it could not be identified as deliberate, that would produce a batch of sugar that spoiled before it could be sold. I knew which of the field workers knew the difference between healthy cane and cane that had been exposed to a particular preparation that would encourage the fungal infection that was already present in St. James Parish soil, and that, under the right conditions, could spread through a field with devastating speed. I knew how to make those conditions right, and I knew, from 3 years of listening to the dead and to the living, that the spirits of the people who had died in that boiling house and in those fields were not neutral about what was growing in them and what was being extracted from them and what had been done to the people doing the extracting. I asked for their help. I performed the ceremonies that my grandmother had taught me were appropriate for this kind of request. Not in secret exactly, because nothing I did was truly secret from the community that surrounded me, but in the privacy of what was understood to be sacred work, with the witnesses who needed to be present and without the ones who did not. The ceremonies were not spectacular. They were quiet and methodical and deeply serious, the work of someone who understood what she was asking and who she was asking it from and what the asking required of her in return. The response was not immediate. The dead are not concerned with human schedules. They operate on a timeline that is not organized around harvest seasons or debt payments or the financial calculations of men who have convinced themselves that they own the earth they stand on. They move when they move, with the precision that comes from existing outside the urgency that the living impose on everything. I waited. The first sign came in July of 1859, 3 months after the branding, when the fungal infection that was always present in St. James Parish soil appeared in the Renard Plantation's southern field with unusual intensity and spread through 2 rows of cane before it was identified. The loss was significant, but not catastrophic. Aldous Renard had it cut back and burned and treated the remaining cane with the methods his overseer knew and watched the rest of the harvest season with the heightened attention of a man who had had a warning. He did not connect it to me. The second sign came in October, during the harvest itself, when 3 consecutive batches in the boiling house came out below grade. The workers who had managed those batches were questioned and punished, which was the response that the system always produced when something went wrong, and which was the response I had anticipated and had ensured would not result in anything that could be traced to deliberate action. The batches were below grade because of a variation in the fuel that I am not going to describe in detail here, except to say that it was a variation that anyone familiar with the boiling process could have introduced without it being visible as introduction rather than error. The men who were punished knew what had happened. They accepted the punishment with the understanding that the cost was part of the work, and that the work was necessary, and that the forces supporting the work had not abandoned them and would not. I treated their injuries afterward. That was also part of the work. By the end of the 1859 harvest season, the Renard plantation's sugar output was 17% below the previous year. 17% was significant. 17%, combined with the southern field loss and the below-grade batches, told the story to anyone with access to the financial documents of a season that had performed significantly worse than the operation's debt structure could comfortably absorb. Aldous Renard noticed. He could not explain it. He had the explanation he had already constructed for himself, the one about labor discipline and the need for stricter oversight, but that explanation did not account for the specific patterns of what had gone wrong, or for the fact that stricter oversight, which he implemented through the winter, did not produce any visible change in the underlying conditions. Something else was wrong. He could feel it the way he had felt the change in the community 3 years earlier. Something in the quality of the air over his plantation that was not right. Something that his eyes could not locate, but that his body registered in the way that bodies register the presence of forces they are not equipped to process through ordinary perception. He connected it to me in February of 1860. He came to my cabin alone, which was unusual. He stood in the doorway with the expression of a man who is trying to look like he has come for one reason while actually being there for another. He asked me if I had any explanation for the previous year's difficulties. He phrased it as an inquiry. His voice had a quality I had not heard in it before. I told him that the land had been worked very hard for a very long time. That land, like people, had limits. That there were ways to work with land that acknowledged those limits and ways that did not, and that the consequences of the two approaches were different. He looked at me for a long moment. "You're doing something," he said. "I don't know what it is exactly, but you're doing something." "I am doing my work," I said. "Your work is healing." "Yes," I said, "it is." He left. I went back to the dead. The ceremony I performed in March of 1860 was the most serious I had undertaken since arriving at the Renard plantation. It required 3 days of preparation and the participation of 12 people from the community who had agreed to participate with full understanding of what they were participating in. It called upon the forces that I had spent my life learning to work with to move from the gradual and subtle phase of what had been happening to a more direct one. I want to be clear about what I mean by direct. I did not ask for death. I want that to be clearly understood. Not because death was beyond what had been done to the people on that plantation, not because the arithmetic of suffering and loss and deliberate cruelty did not produce a number that might seem to justify it, but because asking for death as an outcome was not within the obligations I had accepted when I began this work. The forces I worked with could produce death. They had produced death before, and would produce it again in the course of events that practitioners set in motion. But asking for it specifically was a line my grandmother had been explicit about, not because it was morally absolute, but because the costs of crossing it were costs that rippled outward in ways that affected not just the person who crossed the line, but the community she was responsible for. I asked for ruin. Complete, documented, undeniable ruin. The kind that could not be recovered from. The kind that would remove the Renard family from the land they had built on the suffering of 143 people and leave them with nothing that those people had not also lost. The dead heard me. What followed over the next 2 years was the kind of accumulated disaster that the rational mind categorizes as misfortune and the experienced practitioner recognizes as response. The 1860 harvest was worse than 1859. The fungal infection that had appeared in the southern field spread to the eastern section despite the treatments Renard had applied. A fire in the boiling house in September destroyed the largest kettle and 3 weeks of production while it was repaired. The sugar prices in New Orleans dropped in November to their lowest point in 6 years due to market conditions that had nothing to do with the Renard plantation and everything to do with the timing that the dead operate on. Then the war came. The war that had been building for years arrived in 1861, and with it came disruptions to the sugar market and the labor system, and the financial arrangements that had held the plantation economy together that no individual practitioner could have produced, and that the forces of history were producing with the thoroughness of something that had been building for longer than anyone currently alive. I watched it arrive. I want to be honest about something. The war was not my doing. The forces that produced it operated at a scale that was far beyond what any practitioner, however serious, could access or direct. What I had done was smaller and more specific and more intimate. What the war did was remove the structure that had contained what I and everyone like me were navigating inside of. It did not free us immediately. The ending of slavery was not the work of a moment or a ceremony or a single act of resistance, however precisely calculated. It was the result of forces accumulated over 250 years, finally becoming too large for the system containing them. But within that larger movement, what I had done mattered. It mattered because when the Renard plantation's operations were disrupted by the war and the market and the accumulated damage of 2 years of spiritual work, Aldous Renard did not have the financial reserves to absorb the disruption. The 17% shortfall in 1859 and the worse results of 1860 had already pushed him against the limits of his debt structure. The war's disruption pushed him past those limits. He was unable to meet his obligations to his creditors in the spring of 1862. The proceedings that followed were legal and financial and impersonal in the way that such proceedings are, conducted by courts and banks and lawyers who had no knowledge of or interest in what had preceded them. They produced, by the autumn of 1862, the forced sale of the Renard plantation to satisfy the debts that could not otherwise be met. 143 people became briefly the property of the bank that held the estate. Then, in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation extended to the parishes of Louisiana that were under Union control. St. James Parish was under Union control. On a Thursday morning in January of 1863, I walked out of the Renard plantation as a free woman. I carried with me what my grandmother had carried across the water from Saint-Domingue: the knowledge, the hands that held it, the relationship with the dead that had been the foundation of everything I had done and everything she had done before me and everything her grandmother had done before that. I also carried the scar on my left shoulder, the cross that Aldous Renard had put there in April of 1859. I have thought about that scar a great deal in the years since, about what he intended it to mean and what it actually means. He intended it as a mark of condemnation, as an identification, as a way of making visible what he was afraid of, so that his fear had an object he could point to. He intended it as a declaration that what I was had been named and contained and reduced to something manageable. What it actually is a record. A record that he saw me, that he was afraid of what he saw, that his fear produced an act that confirmed everything the forces I worked with had already decided about him, that the mark he put on me to identify me as something to be feared became the evidence in my body of why the fear was not irrational. He was right to be afraid. He just did not understand what he was afraid of or what it was capable of or what the costs of antagonizing it would turn out to be. Aldous Renard died in New Orleans in 1867, not of anything I did or asked for, of the accumulated damage of a man who had lost everything he built and whose sense of self had been entirely constructed from what he owned and could therefore not survive the loss of it. He died in a boarding house in a city that no longer had a place for the kind of man he had been, in a Louisiana that was being remade into something his understanding of the world could not contain. The plantation was eventually subdivided. Some of the land was purchased by formerly enslaved people, which would not have surprised my grandmother, and which did not surprise me, because the dead had been clear about what the ruin was for. Not punishment as an end in itself, transformation, the removal of one thing so that something else could exist in its place. I settled in New Orleans. I continued the work my grandmother had given me, the healing, the ceremonies, the conversations with the dead that had been the foundation of everything I was. I trained 2 women who had the gift and the willingness to accept the responsibility that came with it, passing forward what had been passed to me, maintaining the thread that connected the living to the ancestors, and the ancestors to the living in the long chain of knowledge that the plantation had tried and failed to break. I am not famous. My name does not appear in the documents that historians will search when they try to understand what happened in Louisiana during the years I have described. What appears in those documents is the financial collapse of the Renard plantation, the legal proceedings, the sale, the transfer. The causes of those events are not documented because the causes were not visible to the people who maintained documents. That invisibility was always the point. My grandmother crossed water to bring her knowledge here. I used that knowledge to cross the distance between what was and what should have been, to move the Renard plantation from the first category to the second, to do in the language of the forces I worked with what no court in Louisiana would have done in the language of the law. They called me a witch for talking to the dead. The dead and I gave them something to talk about. The scar on my shoulder is a cross. I have decided to let it stay, not because I accept what he meant by it, because I know what it means.
This is the story of Delphine, known on the Renard plantation in St. James Parish, Louisiana, as the witch, the practitioner, the woman who talked to the dead. Born into slavery approximately in the year 1825, she served as the healer and spiritual practitioner for the Renard plantation's enslaved community from 1840 to 1863. The Renard plantation's financial records, preserved in the St. James Parish Courthouse, document 2 consecutive years of significantly reduced sugar output beginning in 1859, followed by the forced sale of the estate in 1862 to satisfy outstanding debts. No official record connects these events to Delphine. She was freed under the Emancipation Proclamation in January of 1863 and settled in New Orleans, where she continued practicing as a healer and spiritual advisor in the free black community until her death in 1881. Her story was preserved through the oral traditions of the New Orleans voodoo community and through the women she trained, who passed it down through generations as an example of what was possible when the old knowledge was applied with patience and precision and the willingness to accept the costs of using it for something that mattered. Her grandmother's name was Marguerite. That name survived because Delphine said it at the beginning of every ceremony she performed for 38 years as the first word of every ritual she conducted. The dead, she said, needed to know you remembered where you came from before they were willing to help you with where you were going. If Delphine's story moves in you, the particular recognition of a woman who understood that the most powerful forces available to her were the ones that could not be seen, and could not be branded, and could not be contained by any iron that a frightened man could press against her skin. Subscribe now and join a community that refuses to let these voices be buried again. These are the stories they called witchcraft because they could not explain them, and could not control them, and could not make them fit into the story they were telling about who had power and who did not. Leave a comment. Tell us where you are watching from. Tell us what Delphine's story means to you, because the dead she talked to are still speaking, and the forces she worked with are still moving, and the knowledge her grandmother carried across the water is still here, in the hands of the women who received it, in the thread that connects the living to the ancestors, and the ancestors to the living, unbroken, unburnable, impossible to brand with any iron that fear has ever made.